that he led as a result brought this attention, it seems, to a more mainstream audience. And now we are seeing discussion of kids outside in these really, I mean, PBS NewsHour, New York Times, you know, lots of coverage in all different media platforms in terms of getting kids outside. We've also seen that nature-based preschools, that is schools that have really said nature is core to how we teach or to our pedagogy, that number keeps growing. When we opened the preschool here in Midland in 2007, there were only 12 that we knew of that really called themselves a nature-based preschool. Now there's, well, the number here is 585, but that was at the beginning of 2020. It's well over 600 now that have added themselves or self-designated themselves to the Natural Start Alliance map and have been part of that survey. I'm sure there are more out there. And this is only preschools. This doesn't include infant toddlers necessarily. It doesn't include K3 as well when we think about early childhood. And for those of you that may not be as familiar with the early childhood world, when we talk about early childhood, we're talking about children from 0 to 8. So it does span these different the different dynamics that happen in education in terms of things that happen before school age and things that happen with school age in the way funding is structured and so forth. So yeah, it always makes for interesting dynamic in this work. But the numbers are growing and people continue every day to say, hey, I want to be a nature-based program. And now we're hearing about it even more, right? With COVID, we're hearing lots of, let's get outside, let's be an outdoor school, let's move learning outside. Now, as you hear, as I talk tonight, I'll talk a little bit about, well, I'm not going to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk a lot about what is nature-based education, but that to me is different than just being outside, right? And you'll hear me talk about this idea of learning with nature versus learning in. And a lot of what we're hearing in terms of related to COVID is simply just taking our classrooms and moving them outside. You've seen that with tents and, you know, we're just going to have the classroom outside so there's more airflow. And you all know, as environmental educators, that's very different than using the outdoors as a tool for teaching. But still, there's interest, there's growing interest, and it may be an opportunity for us as environmental educators to jump on that, right? So something to be thinking about. So that's happening right now. So we have this drive. We all know that nature is really critical for healthy development. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on here. I'm just going to remind us that physically kids need nature. Kids that play outside in natural play areas compared to traditional playgrounds have better balance and coordination. Kids who play outside are more active than when they're playing inside. We had to do the research to prove it, but we did it. You know, we kind of probably knew that, but now we really know. We also know that even views of nature helps people recover more quickly from illness. Hospitals now have taken that up and are having hospitals built with windows to natural views instead of the rooftop units, right, for the heating and cooling system. We know that nature helps in prevention of nearsightedness. We've seen a real increase in nearsightedness among children, and being outside actually helps with that. Now you might think, oh, that's because they're not on their screen, right? And that was sort of my first thought, well, oh, that's just because they're away from their screen. But it's actually, we need the natural light, that UV light, for our eye development. And this, later I will talk about disrupting the human nature binary and that we aren't separate from the natural world. And I think this is a prime example of, we need the natural light for our eye development because we're animals, right? That's how we developed. We also need nature for cognitive development, for engaging all of our senses, for creative thinking, for better concentration in order to focus on those academic skills. And so the things that tend to get focused on when we talk about education, of course, fall here in this cognitive, you know, literacy and math and science, maybe if we're lucky, science and social studies, but literacy and math has been the primary focus, unfortunately. But we really want to think about the whole child in this work. Nature is also, of course, important for social emotional development, problem solving with our peers, the ability to handle stress. There's studies that have shown kids who have nature within a mile of their home are able to handle major life stressors better than those that aren't nearby, don't have nature nearby. And again, nearby is within a mile. That's not even really being in it. And of course, we could talk about all of the environmental justice issues that might be inherent in that little piece of data. But the point is, being outside is valuable to their social and emotional development. It's also necessary for spiritual development. We know that being outside connects us to something bigger than ourselves. It's that we're part of something, we're part of a system. And again, I do not mean, I said this earlier, and every time, I don't mean religion, right? This isn't, I don't say spirituality in terms of any kind of religious connection, but just connection to each other, part of a system, and part of this bigger world. And I think that's something that we just don't talk enough about in terms of education. And by the way, a lot of these things we don't talk about, we focus primarily on cognitive development. And then of course, we also care that we're supporting lifelong stewards. So these are some of the reasons to do it, right? Yes, there's been growth in all of these programs, but the question is really why? And hopefully it's because we're accomplishing all of these things and providing children with these, really well-rounded, holistic educational approach. So what is it? How do we define nature-based early childhood education? I think of it as the integration of two disciplines. The first being early childhood education, which of course is focused on child development, and the second being environmental education, which is focused more on environmental sustainability and behavior change. And where those two things come together, when they're really integrated, and I mean the high quality aspects of both, then we have in the middle all of these different nature-based programs. And you'll notice I have these arrows here as this continuum. And within each discipline, there is a continuum of integration of the other discipline, right? So early childhood on the far outside left there is not going to have any environmental education or nature related aspect at all. And the same on the far right of environmental ed might not have nature in there either. So we're going to walk briefly through each of those and what each of those continuum might look like and sort of how that gets integrated into the program. Again, just trying to give you a sense of what is it that we're talking about. So the typical early childhood continuum is that programs start without any nature at all. And sadly, there are a lot of programs out there, early childhood programs, that don't have any kind of nature at all. And by that, I mean, they don't even have windows. They might have an asphalt play area. Then there are those programs that have authentic nature indoors. So they have brought nature into the classroom and maybe have brought materials in for kids to use. They're avoiding what I call the tidy or cutesy versions of nature. And also the stereotypical versions of nature. So really they're focused on what's local and real, having real images of animals and plants that they would actually see locally and not just the cartoon versions. And not that we don't have some storybooks, right? But that we're really focusing on what's authentic nature in the classroom. And then the next step is typically programs look to the outside natural play area. How do we bring loose parts into that play area space so that it isn't just traditional climbing equipment, but we have lots of really a space that looks like a natural area for the most part, has a real, more of a natural look to it. And then lots of natural loose parts like sticks and pine cones and rocks, and then sand, soil, so forth, and then human-made loose parts as well. And you can see the girls there in their fancy dresses in their mud kitchen. I love the combination of juxtaposition of mud boots and dresses, because for some reason there has been this notion that nature schools are great for boys, but not so much for girls. And I have heard that from lots of parents at open houses. They'll say, oh, my son would love that. I'm like, your daughter would too, darn it. So that's another battle we have to fight. But anyway, so that's the next step. And then programs often will start to move beyond the fence into what we just call the beyond. That's actually a phrase that Claire Warden of Scotland coined, that just when we leave the fence, we've moved to the beyond. So we think of that third space as the beyond. So we have 3 spaces of inside, outside, and beyond. Initially, a lot of programs will start just doing that once a month. maybe once a quarter. And this might be for some of you that are at parks or nature centers. You might be hosting those folks, right? So that they're coming with their school on a regular basis. And what's really important about that is that they're visiting that same place over time as much as possible. So it isn't just one time, but they're multiple times in different seasons and really having a relationship, which is why in the middle there, we hope that nature-based programs are doing all three of these every day. And they may not be inside, but they're for sure outside or beyond every day. But in fact, a lot of the year, they're probably not really inside, depending on the weather. So that's the typical early childhood side of the continuum. And then there's the typical environmental ed side. There are a lot of programs, I'm sure nature centers and parks and so forth that just have avoided early childhood programs. And some of that is, little kids just blurt out random things. And sometimes it's hard to find educators and interpreters that are willing to work with them because you never know. They are probably going to tell you about their grandma, and their dog that died last week, and then you have to deal with that. But so the next step is when a lot of organizations have decided, yeah, we are going to try some early childhood work. Typically where that starts is caregiver and tot kinds of programs that happen, casual, on a regular basis, but not every day, right? It's just maybe monthly, maybe even weekly. And maybe some early childhood focused exhibits. That tends to be sort of the first stop. Then there are some programs that now have public natural play areas where they have sort of an area designated that, hey, you can come and use these different loose parts and explore in a sort of designated space of some sort. So they're not just out on the property. And then the next step is hosting those forest school type visits. And in a minute, I'm going to define what the heck is a forest school versus a nature preschool and all of those things, because there's lots of terms out there. But basically to be a host for those periodic visits. And again, hopefully building a relationship over time. And then some environmental education programs have said, we want to have a full-on nature-based or forest preschool at our site. And so if we think about the difference of this continuum, sort of what are the key markers, it's really thinking about how often is that visitor or the child there? How long are they staying with us? So are they there for half an hour and that's it? Are they there 3 hours, multiple times a week, right? That's sort of the full range. And then are we as educators involved in that experience? So, having this personal versus non-personal experience. So that sort of gives you an idea, hopefully, of the continuum. And again, where those two come together, we have what are these nature-based programs. All of those, if you think about it, integrate nature in terms of how the program is structured, how the physical environment is structured, how we interact in terms of our teacher-child interactions, and all of those things are, of course, developmentally appropriate. And that sort of lays the foundation for what we call nature-based pedagogy, which I'm going to briefly walk through after I first give you some information here on the labels of the terms. So you've probably heard nature-based preschool, nature preschool. In the US, this is the 1 or 2 years before kindergarten. They spend at least 30% of their time outside. And typically these originated in nature centers. So this is the most, this is the most probably familiar or connected to our, to the environmental education world, because that's really where they started was nature centers. The first one, by the way, was in New Canaan Nature Center in New Canaan, Connecticut. And then there's another term, forest preschools. Sometimes you hear them called forest kindergartens. And I try to use forest preschool to distinguish the age range because it still is the 1 or 2 years before kindergarten. And so here in the US, right, we think of that as preschool versus kindergarten. The difference between these two terms typically is how much time is spent outside and if there is an indoor facility of some sort, or the extent of that indoor facility, I should say, because even forest preschools usually have a shelter of some sort, but it really is a shelter and less of a more traditional classroom. And forest kindergarten often gets used because the historical roots of this model are in the German walled kindergartens, which is where you get woods kindergarten, forest kindergarten was the US translation there. Couple last terms here. So then there's nature kindergarten. Well, in the US, that's the grade before first grade, so 5-year-olds, right? And again, this is at least 30% of their time is outdoors. These would be in the public schools. And then we have nature first to 3rd grade. So all of these models are different. People use different terms at different times. There's the last term is forest school. You're like, what? Another term? Sometimes forest school gets used for all of those different other models I just described. But originally, this term forest school came from the UK and is probably more what we would think of as like field trips to a nature center, where there is a naturalist at that, environmental center, nature center, park that is leading the experience. So that's probably the closest we have. But they have an entire certification program in the UK that follows this forest school idea. So when you're learning about programs in the US, you have to kind of decipher where do they fall in these terms. Everyone uses them slightly differently. And the key is to really think about the pedagogy, because that's more important than the model of the program itself. And that's what I want to spend a little time now talking about, is just very briefly, the nature-based pedagogy first at its core is this idea of disrupting the human nature binary, so that we're structuring the programs that we're part of this system. We're part of the ecosystems that we're living in. Every action we have, impacts the natural world and vice versa. And we're trying not to other nature, so that nature isn't somewhere we go to. It isn't, oh, it's over there, but in fact, it's part of our daily lives and everything we do. We do this through extensive daily outdoor time. So every day outside, even in the rain, even in the snow, unless it is really dangerous. And of course, most of the time, if you're wearing the right clothes, the weather around here is not dangerous. Nature-based pedagogy is also child-driven emergent curriculum. So it's really emphasizing learning with nature. And I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. And then the learning occurs in, among, and between 3 physical spaces. So I've already talked about that a little bit: the inside, outside, and beyond. Of course, there's a whole lot more nuance that goes to it, but this gives you the big idea. And again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on how do you do this with young kids, but sort of what are the lessons we can take from this? And so I think the first big lesson is emphasizing learning with nature rather than in or about nature. And I'm going to spend a little time talking about what I mean. First, I think of 3 types of learning. There's learning in the natural world, there's learning about the natural world, and then there's learning with. And learning in is where we have just taken whatever's happening in the classroom and we've moved it outside, right? And that's a lot of what we're seeing right now with COVID, which is great. I'd rather them do that than stay inside for COVID or any other reason, right? Because you hear the birds when you're outside. You feel the wind on your skin. So it's better to go outside. But this learning in doesn't really connect to the natural world at all. I'm not reading something reading a story about a tree while I look at a tree, right? They're sort of disconnected ideas. It's just a space, really. And for the most part, this is teacher-led, but not necessarily. It could be something that the children have decided they want to do. But for preschools, this is classic, where they take the sensory table outside, they just take the books out, and we read a book outside that has nothing to do with the natural world around us. The second thing is learning about nature, where the content that we're learning is, of course, some sort of nature-based content or environmental content. It physically could be inside or outside. It's mostly teacher-led, and it may or may not build over time. So things like me telling a child about the life cycle of a frog or names of birds, that would be learning about nature. Learning with nature, however, almost always occurs outside, and it's almost always outside of teachers' plans, because we're really using the natural world as another teacher. It's moments that emerge out of our experiences. So here you see the kids found this pile of scat and they're just thrilled, right? Because kids love poop, but especially young kids. Let's be honest. And what this does is it gives personal meaning to the learning about nature, because the next thing that's going to happen is, yeah, we're going to talk about the scat, and starts with an S. Yeah, comes out of you. You can put the next line in the chat. So, it gives personal meaning to this experience, as opposed to me just like standing there and telling you what scat is, right? And the other thing with learning with is that it builds over time. So we're going to connect ideas from what we did yesterday, what we did last week, how this has changed over time. And it creates a reason to want to learn about, right? That I'm not just telling you information, but now these kids are excited. They want to know. They're like, that's cool. What's that from? Why does it look like that, right? They now have questions that are actually about their own experience. Okay, so the thing here to how do we do this? How do we kind of take this idea of learning with nature and apply it in non-formal programs or whatever your particular program is? I think the first thing is to value experiences over rote memorization. It's hard because a lot of times we have goals and objectives. We've promised the schools that we're going to give you, they're going to walk away knowing these things. And yet we only often have an hour and a half more, maybe a little bit more, but not a whole lot, right, of time with them. And so if we can really focus on the experience of actually getting to touch the frog and noticing what did it feel like and what color was it, and right, that's a whole lot different than doing a worksheet that this is what I am a frog. And I know you all aren't doing worksheets. This is sort of my crass, like extreme version. But that we really focus on the experience. And last night, one thing that David sort of hinted at it, but that he has talked about quite a bit, is how they need to touch those things, right? They need to have the experience with the real, like get in there and get dirty and get muddy, and then they have something to connect to later. And then they'll want to know, what's that called, and why is its eye smaller than its tympanic membrane, and what gender or sex rather would that make it? It's not a gender, because as Brian said, insects and frogs don't have genders. But what sex is it? I'll let you all answer that one in the chat as well. Do they get trivia prizes for this, Carla? All right. So another example of this sort of learning with idea and connecting to kids' experiences and letting it be experience driven. Here's the story that I like to tell. This kid here on the left, you notice his hairdo. This is important to this story, right? His mohawk there. He had brought some leaves into the classroom, and he had a leaf in his hand, and I was like, oh, what have you got there? Because he was kind of waving it in my face. And he was like, oh, it's a white oak. And I was like, oh, all right. Sure enough, and you all know that there aren't many adults that know the difference between a red oak and a white oak, let alone a 4-year-old. And so I was like, yeah, that's right. I said, well, what about that other one you've got in your leaf or in your hand? And he looked at it, and he looked back at me, and he looked back at his leaf, and he kind of turned it around. And I thought, okay, well, he doesn't know, smarty pants. But he looked at that leaf, and it had really fine toothed edging on it. And he looked at it, and he looked up at me in all seriousness. He said, it's a mohawk leaf. And I was like, all right. And at first you think, oh, that's a cute kid story, right? Like, oh, that's nice. He likes mohawks. He named it. But we all know he could have gone to a tree book and eliminated half of the trees, right? He could have narrowed it down pretty darn quickly because he noticed what was important to him. But that was because he had this experience. He'd collected those. That leaf meant something to him, and he had named it, and it had become personal to him. And so that was another example, sort of that experience idea. Here's another example that happened in one of the preschools. They found a dead yellow-bellied sapsucker, and they took it back to the classroom and decided to draw it. And then they started asking questions about it, and they took notes on all of their questions. Of course, my favorite is, where's the guy's butt? which honestly, I never really thought about, like, where's a bird's butt? Like, it's a good question. We talk about rumps, but anyway. So, right, that's a 4-year-old that has these questions, and maybe a coyote ate it. Why did it die? Or, how is it dead? Or, why is it dead? How did it die? They had all these questions. So that actually led to them deciding to explore this a little further. And because of this experience, they were excited and curious about it. And they had previously found a dead deer out in the woods and put a motion sensor camera out. So then they could see what would come to the deer. And so they did that with this bird. And then they would go back and visit this over time. And so you'll see here the sapsuckers out in the woods. The turkey was walking by, the raccoon was walking by, and then eventually a house cat found it. And the kids, of course, had questions about why would the house cat want to eat our dead bird? That's just silly. So the horse and the alligator next to the markers. Yeah, you got to have all your tools for your drawing. So anyway, this is an example of those. It was an experience. Some people might call it a teachable moment, but that extended, right? That we built on and that we really leveraged in the learning as we continued. So again, we want to think about, how do we emphasize learning with nature? The questions to ask as we're reflecting on your practice and as you're thinking about your own programs, because you may or may not be working with 4-year-olds. Do our programs include time for exploration and discovery? And do we do that first? Is that the starting point, so that the next thing that we're even teaching about, right, the learning about, is connected to the experience? How much do we emphasize facts and the right answer over the sense making, over figuring out? What experiences do they have to bring to the table to help with figuring out what's happening around them? Do how and why questions dominate our interactions, or are we doing the sort of quizzing of things we've told them already? And by the way, this happens in early childhood as well. So these are questions that I'm always asking our teachers to reflect on. And then also thinking about, how are we allowing for silence in our teaching? Right? Do we have times where they can just be quiet outside? If some of these kids may never have really spent much time outside, do they have an opportunity to really hear, just how loud the birds can be at different times, or how quiet they can be, or that squirrel that's over there just chattering away because he's, Brian, because it's, heard us walking by. It is such a habit. We do that a lot. Okay, the second lesson is thinking about really seeing children as capable and competent. And this is hard, and it is not embedded in our American culture by any means. But to really think about, kids being capable of big ideas and taking care of themselves. And so how does that look? Well, first of all, a couple assumptions that are sort of embedded with learning with nature that I want to highlight. That's the idea that nature provides way more than we can ever plan for. And you all know this, like, you have a plan in mind, and then you go outside and it's like all these other amazing things happen, and there's no way you could have set that up ahead of time, right? But the other thing is that we really believe that children should be heard. They already have a voice. It's just that we're not listening, right? That children are capable, they're competent, and part of that comes to life in really valuing risky play, and seeing that as an important part of learning. So we're going to focus primarily on these ideas of really kids being capable and competent, and how does that come to life in our programming? First, just really briefly, there's 6 types of risky play. So there's great heights, high speed, dangerous tools, the cutting and strangling. It always kind of gets people when you say strangling, but the idea of ropes and knives and axes and so forth. Dangerous elements, rough and tumble, the idea of disappearing or getting lost. Oops, sorry, to go back real quick. So those are sort of the 6 big types of risky play. But of course, they look different at different ages. So what might be really high for a 2-year-old is very different than what's really high for an 8-year-old, right? There's a full range here. But do we have opportunities for kids to do these things? And in your program, that might be, if you're out with a group of kids in the woods, that you let them run, right? Like, adults don't let kids run very often. It's amazing. Like, stop and use your inside voice, right? Like, they're finally outside. So let them use their outside voice every once in a while, and then facilitate silence, and let them run, right? Have that high speed and other opportunities for some of these risky play moments. So here's an example just to highlight the difference of what it might look like. This is a 3-year-old. He was 3 in this at this time. This is what risky play looked like to him.
Oh. Are you big? Yeah. You want to go with us?
Uh-oh.
What would you like to do?
You did it!
What do you want to do while we're waiting?
I love that face when he does that. But look, he, like, for him, that was a huge deal to stand up on that stump. And so we've been thinking about in our programs, like, do we allow kids to walk on the stumps? Do we, if you have a rail, like at our nature center, we had a rail along the edge of this kind of boardwalk space. The kids love to walk along. And I had staff all the time that would try to tell kids to stop doing that. I'm like, let them walk on it, right? So that's a moment of, for them, what feels like risky play that we can facilitate and encourage. Yeah, a very proud face. He was very proud of himself. So how do we do that? One way in supporting children and weighing the benefits and the risks that are inherent in play. So the first way we do that is to think out loud ourselves so that we're really explicit in thinking about safety and just modeling it. So I'm not even necessarily asking for their input, but just, oh, we're getting ready to go on a hike. So, I have my first aid kit with me, or I have the radio so we can call back if we need to, or I have my, waterproof boots on because we're gonna go to the pond and I want to keep my feet, dry and safe. So, I mean, we use the safe word a lot with 3 and 4-year-olds, but that thinking out loud and sort of modeling it in terms of weighing those benefits and risks. But we can also do that with kids and help them to be thinking about it. And you can do that with any age in any of your programs. And there's 3 big questions. The first is, why should we do this? What's great about this activity? So if we think about puddles, for example, like, why should we jump in puddles? Because it's fun, because we're going to make a huge splash, because we're going to get our clothes dirty and we'll make mom mad and that'll be funny, right? Or whatever. Like, you ask kids and they'll give you all sorts of ideas. Then how might we get hurt? What might hurt us doing this activity? Puddle jumping, if they're running off of a log into a puddle, it's like, well, we might slip and fall and hit our head. It might say we might drown. You just never know where they're going to go with that. And then, okay, how do we keep ourselves safe from that? Well, we're not going to run off the log, or we're going to take turns so we don't jump on each other. And if we fall in the puddle, we're going to stand up so we don't drown in the puddle, right? And I seriously have had this conversation with kids. And I was telling a story about this afternoon about a group of kids in Scotland that had licensing challenges over licensing wanted them to remove the puddles. And so they had conversation with the kids, and the kids were like, no, we're not going to drown in the puddle. We just stand up, right? And that's an example of, like, they're capable. They know, they're just going to stand up. They never move past their own comfort level. If we trust them and help them in trusting their own gut, they will stay within their abilities almost always. And so that's part of that, reminding them, or living the idea that they're capable and competent. And one way we do that, again, is through this benefit risk assessment and really thinking about safety. So even if you have rules already in place, like if you go to the pond and you're doing, dipping at the pond, you could still do these questions with them, like, hey, we're at the pond and we're gonna look for frogs. Why should we do that? Because it's fun. And then, how might we get hurt? They'll be able to give you some input and what are the rules. So now you've sort of created a group norms, right, for behavior that has come from them. And we've also been explicit about safety, rather than just telling them one way or the other that these are the rules. That's awesome, Paul. You saw an adult walking across the lawn. Yeah, adults need it too. Another way, so we've talked about these 2 ideas already in terms of living the idea that children are competent and capable, allowing for beneficial risk, right? Engaging them in the benefit risk assessment. And then another thing is to give children choices as much as we can. And I'm sure you've heard that if you've been around anything related to behavior management, but kids want choices, and they're actually more apt to be engaged and participating if they know that they have options, right? And that's part of their listening to their voice, because they have one, and it's just, what are their choices? That can be as simple as, if you're handing out markers for an activity, you've got a blue and a red one, would you like a blue or a red one? And let them choose one, right? It can be that simple to, hey, there's 2 ways to get to this, to where we're going today. We're going to the pond again, let's say. We can go this way and we might see these things, or we could go this way and we might see these things, and give them a voice in that, and a choice in that option. But really to hear them and allow them to have some input. The other thing is to encourage them to do things for themselves. And with preschoolers, that's as simple as standing there and coaching them through how to get dressed. That's giving them real utensils and ways to pour their own milk. And yeah, it's going to spill, but they've got to learn how to pour it at some point, right? And so to encourage them to learn how to do those things for themselves. So, are there places where that could happen in your programs as well? And again, listening to what they have to say. So it's funny, there are definitely times where kids can tell these stories that feel like they're completely out of left field. Like, what is that about? And at the same time, often if we really listen to what they're saying, it's like, oh, they are connecting to what the topic is. It may just be a little hard for them to get there, right? And it's not quite as obvious. So I talked about the mohawk. Even that is sort of one of those cute stories that people might just kind of blow off and not really realize, oh, wait a minute, he was talking about the edging, right? What that leaf was structured like that's kind of huge. I had another kid that was walking through the woods and he saw this tree. It was fall, so there were leaves down all around us, and there was this tree that didn't have any leaves on it, and he goes, that one's dead. And I was like, oh, and I just let silence, right? I didn't respond or anything. And then he goes, well, see how that one still has needles? I'm like, yeah. And he goes, it's not dead. I was like, oh, okay. And he goes, well, this one, how, and I just, I just gave it time to listen to him. And he said, how some animals come out at night and some come out during the day? And I was like, yes, I do know. And he gave a couple examples, and he's like, well, or like, how some flowers close up at night and then they open up during the day. This is a 4-year-old, y'all, a 4-year-old. And I'm like, yes. He's like, it's like that, right? So because I took the time to listen to him, he just explained dormancy to me, but he didn't have the language to do it, but he had the concept, right? He didn't need, I could then label and give him that word. And we did end up talking about that. Like, oh, there's a term for that, because he knew. He's like, well, it's not like they're really dead, but it's going to come back, but I don't really know how to explain it to you, right? But because we took the time to really listen to that story, I realized, oh gosh, he has all sorts of knowledge to bring to this, conversation. And again, this is a 4-year-old. So ways to think about sort of how to support and acknowledge that kids are competent and capable. And in reflecting on your practice, here are a few questions to think about. How are we making time and space to listen to children? Do we have time where we can really hear them in the program? How can we give children more choices? And it's little things. Is it, do you want the aerial net or the sweep net, right? It can be that simple, but having opportunities for choices. Are we encouraging children to do things for themselves? So are we really supporting them in they're gonna, from getting themselves ready to go outside to pouring their own snacks, whatever it may be, are we really encouraging them to do that for themselves as opposed to doing it for them? And then also, how are we supporting beneficial and risky play, right? Are there opportunities that we can support that more so? We might be doing that, some of that, but can we be more intentional about adding it into the programs? All right, the third thing I want to talk about is supporting learning that crosses boundaries. So we want to support all of the learning across multiple boundaries. I already mentioned, we talked about learning inside, outside, and beyond. And so to sort of apply that idea in bigger ways or other ways. In the teaching, one way we do that is, this is an example of, they sign in. Here in the middle is a sign in. So the parents arrive and they have to sign their child in, but we always have a sign in for children as well. These are emergent writers. So they aren't writing yet. The two names that you see there that you can probably read are the teachers, but the others are kids, right, that had scribbled. But we asked them to make a prediction of what's going to happen when we go to the beyond. How many insects do you think we'll find? Right, so there's a little math in there, there's some writing, but it's also connecting to what we're going to be doing later in the beyond. Then head outside, go and look for insects, then maybe collect loose parts and come back inside, or we could do this outside. And they actually built an insect. And so they made an insect out of all of their different loose parts. Now you'll notice here, we didn't give them an example of an insect and say, make it like this, but rather here's a bunch of materials, build your insect. If they build it with 12 legs, that's okay. It's an opportunity to talk about how many legs they have. And then, oh, yours only has 5, right? And yours has wings and yours doesn't, right? We can do this sort of comparing and contrasting of the things that they create. But the idea here is that the experiences that happen outside and beyond the fence also relate to what we're doing inside. And so really being explicit about how those different learning activities connect to each other across the spaces. Another example of that I might be looking for frogs. So here's a book, great book, 999 Tadpoles, if you aren't familiar with it. It's a fun one. And then go out, look for frogs, tadpoles, all sorts of other things that we're likely going to find, right? And have a wonderful experience. And then you also could, in this case, we brought that back into the preschool and had the little mini pond in the classroom so they can continue that exploration. If you're not familiar, probably you all have seen this and done this in your programs, but that's 2 hula hoops on top of each other with a binder clip and a white shower curtain so that it has a nice contrast for looking at things inside. So again, this idea that the teacher-led activities that we're sort of directing them to do connect to each other across those spaces. Then we can also think about crossing grade level boundaries. So, you know, we've talked about preschool, but there's now also this nature-based movement is happening in K3 as well. And so some K3 programs are doing a 1 day a week nature immersion, something like Nature Days or Forest Fridays. And David talked a little bit about that yesterday. You saw some clips of the different videos of that. And then there's other programs that are doing daily outdoor experiences. They're going out every day as part of their curriculum. And really the goal here is that the classroom teacher is integrating nature versus nature being a special. So, you know, like music and some of those different, sometimes foreign languages, they become something that just happens once a week and a different teacher comes in and teaches that. And our goal in this case is for the classroom teacher to be doing it ultimately, because then it gets integrated again into all those different learning activities. So it might be, oh, we had this outdoor experience and now this teacher integrates it into literacy and math and so forth throughout the day. So it's really an opportunity here to connect formal and non-formal education, right? Yeah, it might be a little, oh, are you worried about the just being able to see them for macros? Yeah, it'd be a little challenging. Remember, these are 4-year-olds. They can't squeeze those. They want to squeeze the tadpoles. All right. Okay, so connecting the formal and non-formal is an opportunity here. And it's an opportunity for all of us as environmental educators because, first of all, K-12 teachers are not trained with natural history knowledge. They don't have it, right? If they have it from their own experience, they may bring that to the table, but for the most part, they don't really know about the local natural history. They also have questions about logistics, like how do I take kids outside? Like what do they wear? What kind of nets do I need to get for the pond that's behind the school, right? And this is where you all have that knowledge and those skills and can help teachers with that. You know how to manage a group on the trail. That does not scare you at all. You're not worried about kids running off, right? K-12 teachers aren't trained that way. It is very different from their training and the pedagogy they're used to. And so this is an opportunity to partner and work together, again, to hopefully build their capacity to do it on their own. But initially, at least, they're going to need some help doing that. So what are some things to be thinking about and how to maybe build that relationship? First of all, it's learning the lingo of formal education. So do you understand what it is they need to accomplish, right? This is the classic knowing your audience. And what is it that they need, and what is being talked about in formal education? What are standards and NGSS and all of those different things, which I think we talked earlier, Indiana has not adopted NGSS, but whatever your particular standards are, and so forth, that they have to meet. And then helping them to articulate, and you being able to articulate how that outdoor learning, nature-based learning, supports their goals. Here's how we can help you accomplish that science goal. Here's how we can help you accomplish that literacy goal, whatever it may be. And then again, it's really building relationships with the leaders of the schools. So I get asked all the time, is it better to start with the teacher or the administrators? It depends. The best person to start with is who you have a relationship with, right? And if you have to build a relationship, then start with whoever is willing to have a relationship with you. Sort of like dating, but with the schools, right? So figuring out how do we have a relationship with the school leaders, but if you can get administrators fired up about it, sometimes you can have bigger sort of school-wide changes. And really striving for this outdoor learning to be a regular part of the formal K-12 education, that it's just built in and embedded. And I know you all are working on this. Yeah, have a cup of coffee or beer with the superintendent, absolutely. And that's honestly how we got the nature kindergarten, which then grew to nature first grade, which then grew to nature second grade here in town. I invited the superintendent, it was brand new to the job, and I just said, hey, come on out. And he came on out. It was a pouring down rain, and he showed up in a suit and an umbrella. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be rough, right? And we stood inside because I didn't want him to get wet. I was being thoughtful. We stood inside and looked out the window at the kids. And he was like, look at them. He's like, they're measuring, they're pouring that water and measuring the water if it's raining. And I mean, he was just blown away and immediately sold. And now, so we did a little backwards. Now we have beer together. When we started, it was just an invitation, but now he's a good friend. And that's, by the way, how I measure is, yeah, can you have coffee or beer with them? And also, can you text them? For me, that's always a good sign of a relationship with, whether it's a principal, a teacher, superintendent, is can I text them at 8 o'clock at night, some random thing? Then I know we have a really solid relationship. So questions to be thinking about in terms of supporting the learning across boundaries. How are we making connections across the learning spaces in our program while they're there? But also, how are we connecting to children's other lived experiences? What's happening at home? And then how can we better support K-12? Because it's not just, we don't want these just isolated experiences outside, right? But that we're building over time and integrating it into their lives so that it's just a daily part of what they do. All right, fourth lesson here is to focus on the heart. We started with that video and you all said joy and wonder and happiness, and that's really where we want to focus. We want to focus on the whole child that integrates cognitive development, social, emotional, physical, spiritual, but it's joyful, right? I mean, this kid, doesn't he just look like he's having a blast? Like, just so excited to be leaping off into that puddle. Also because it's probably March, I'm guessing, in this picture, and it's like finally a nice sunny warm day, and just all the joy that comes with that as well. But to really focus on the whole child. So I have a question for y'all. I have a poem here, and I want to know how you relate to this poem, or whether or not you do. You've probably heard it before. The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. It's a good one if you've even heard it before, so hopefully it won't bother you to hear it one more time. Sorry, I've got to move the chat, and when I did that, the mouse took it away. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Yeah, one of my all-time favorites, yes. I mean, this poem, it's like, yes, right? Like, just if for me, I go outside, it's like, oh, and all those worries and all of that chaos just falls away. So if we're going to focus on the heart, how do we do this for all children? Don't all children deserve that kind of feeling, right? And how do we get that? And that, for most of us, it's probably why we're here in the first place, is we have this deep connection and really resonate with Wendell thoughts here, right? Like, yes, absolutely. And so how do we leverage that? So the question for you all is to think about your own why. So why are you here? Why are you passionate about this? You know, what really drove you to become an environmental educator? And then to share that passion, right? They need you to share that with them. Like, the fact that, you know, you're super excited about insects and like, just, oh my gosh, right? And you find something new and you go running through the woods. It's amazing. Like, that has lasting impact. I still think about my uncle, who was a mammologist, and we were out in the field in Wyoming, and all of a sudden, I mean, he was this tall guy and he just took off running after, I don't even remember what he was running after, but he was so excited and he was like a little kid again, right? And then he told me, I remember he told me all about it again. I can't remember what it was. I just remember him running off because he was so passionate about it. And kids need to see that, right? That, like, your heart, that they can see, like, this is why you're fired up about it. If you let that out, they see it, right? They know it, and they definitely need to feel that. And it's also coming back to the awe and wonder that we all talked about in the chat box. We talk about it often. We quote Rachel Carson, and, oh, it's a sense of wonder. And I push on nature preschools all the time with this, because we say, yeah, you know, when we go to the beyond, it's these magical moments, and it's moments to connect with something bigger than ourselves and have these moments of awe and wonder. And then often we've sort of given them an activity, and this is what we're going to do, and let's go. And we don't actually take the time to allow for those moments of awe and wonder. So yes, we want to show our enthusiasm. We also, and demonstrate our own curiosity and wonder. And then again, using open-ended questions and allowing things to sort of linger there, that maybe they don't know the scientific name for whatever they've found, but they know that's so cool and I want to know more about it, you know. And you've directed them with open-ended questions to sort of start making sense of what they're experiencing. And then again, of course, don't forget that silence really is a powerful tool, and to take the moment, if you walk up on the great blue heron, right, to just, oh, let's just sit there and watch for a minute, right? So bit of a pyro. I catch glimpses of the chat, and I'll go back and look at it later. So how do we focus on the heart? You know, what are some questions we can ask? First is, what is your why for doing this work? Why are you here? And what does it really mean to you to do this? And how are you sharing that why with the children you work with? How's that coming out and being lived in your day-to-day? Are you sort of doing something that you don't really want to do, you're not as passionate about? Well, do the passionate thing, like, let that passion come out, that excitement, right? It makes it personal that way. And then just be thinking about, how am I facilitating these moments of awe and wonder? Am I allowing for experiences, going full circle back to learning with nature? Am I allowing for those experiences to occur? And if this child only learns one thing from me, what do I want it to be? And maybe even a different way of saying it, instead of learning, is experience. If this child only experiences one thing with me, what do I want that to be? And maybe it is information, but most often it's probably that feeling, right? That feeling in their heart of like, wow, that's so cool, right? Like, we started off when we started about talking about the sandhill cranes, like, to stand there in that and just see all of them and hear that noise. Wow, right? That has a different kind of heart feeling. So to think about those questions when you're thinking about focusing on the heart. And then the final lesson, that is definitely not something we have learned in nature-based education, but we are working on, and that's to be more inclusive, because the fact of the matter is, we don't serve all children right now. This I'm going to go through some results of a survey that Natural Start Alliance did in 2017 of nature preschools, and compare that to the US population. So in 2017, there were 275 programs. As I said, there's more than 585 now. There's about 6,000 children in those programs. In the US, there are, in K-12, there are 50.6 million public school students. So if, you know, again, that's K-12. So if you divide that 13, you get what, like 3-ish million kids. Round up by 1 million or down by 1 million. 2 million is still a whole lot away, farther away from 6,000, right? We're not even close to serving all of the preschoolers or K-12 students in the country. These nature-based preschools, there were 22% of those programs that responded had no dual language learners at all. And yet we know that in the population, there's about 10% of students in the US are English language learners. You'll notice that I use the phrase dual language in nature preschools. That's the way the survey was. We often use dual or multilingual because, of course, when you're 4, you're learning your native language and whatever your second or third language is. So in the US stats used English language learners. In the nature-based preschools, 27% of them had no children with special needs at all. And yet we know the US population, there's about 13% of the population that receives some sort of special education services. So you see, we're not serving these populations at all in terms of really representing what's happening in the US. 16% of the children in the nature-based preschools were non-whites. And in the US, of course, 52% of the population are non-whites. So if we sort of narrow it down, basically, nature-based preschools are for the most part serving white, middle-class, suburban families. Not all of them, but that's mostly the populations that are being served by these programs. And we really have to think about how do we serve everyone. So if we really believe that nature is valuable for all children, and we talked about all of those joys and wonders and you know, how it impacts our life and our physical development, cognitive, social, emotional, spiritual, stewardship, right? We have to think about how do we serve everyone and provide those experiences for all children. And we definitely in nature-based early childhood have a lot of room for improvement, you know, and have to think about what does that look like in all of our programs, including environmental and non-formal programs. So how do we do that? You know, to be thinking about how to work to be more inclusive, think about how can we serve all of the families in our community? And, you know, that's race and ethnicity, that's economics, it's family structure, it's families that work third shift or second shift, right? How do we serve everyone in our programming? How do we serve all of the schools in our community? So we're not just focusing on the schools that have money and so they can pay us or that are, you know, closer to us, but how do we kind of extend our reach a little more to serve all of the schools in our community? And then thinking about how do we meet their needs, right? So that it isn't so much about what we want to provide. We want you to have this experience, but rather what is it that those families and schools need? And then how can we help them to accomplish that and meet those needs? And then throughout all of it, how can we sustain all of the cultures, right, while providing positive outdoor experiences? You know, our sort of historical roots are in environmental ed, probably, especially in nature study, right, is a very sort of British collecting and naming approach to our outdoor experiences. And that doesn't align necessarily with all cultures, right? Not even necessarily, it doesn't align with all cultures. And so how can we be more open to supporting all of cultures? So I realize this is big ideas, but really important questions for us to have. And again, we have not figured this out in nature-based early childhood yet. You know, we're working on it, but we have a long ways to go for sure. All right, so this is where we've been. We talked a little bit about what is nature-based early childhood education. We've talked about these 5 lessons that hopefully gives you a little glimpse into what we do in the nature preschool world, but also helps you to think about the work that you're doing as well. And so as we move forward, I just encourage you to be kind of thinking about making small changes, and remember that you don't have to do all of this overnight. You don't have to fix it, fix everything or change everything overnight. And this is the same I talk about with traditional teachers that are trying to do more nature things, like, oh, there's so much. Just, set a goal where you'd like to be. And with them, I always say start small and try it more than once, especially if they're talking about like getting kids outside. But, if you're working with the local schools and you reach out once and they don't respond, reach out again. If you try with one school and it didn't really work, try with a different school, right? Multiple times, because there's all sorts of factors that are in play. Be patient with yourself, kids, coworkers, other schools. I mean, especially now working with the schools is really challenging with COVID and all of the pressure that schools are under, as though they weren't already under enough pressure as it was, right? And then connect with other people, as you're doing right now, that are doing this work, and what's working in your community, and how can we continue to learn from that. So I just hit the 8 o'clock. Sorry, Carla, I'm running. I was trying, but I am happy to answer any questions you have. Please, here's my email and the website. I hope you'll reach out if we don't have a chance to talk tonight. But I really thank you for having me. This is great. Virtual is weird. I'm in Indiana, but I'm really at home. But it was still great to see you all. And I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can see all of your faces, and if there's any questions.
If you do have a specific question, feel free to put it in the chat room or unmute, and you can go ahead and share it now. And Rachel, you did completely fine. Thank you so much for exploring with us on the Zoom call, and you had a lot of great wisdom to share with us. I especially enjoyed the questions on inclusivity at the end, and just those steps that we can take little by little to get there. We're not going to change everything tomorrow, but we can make goals little by little and take steps in that direction to make a change. And I love that concept of doing with instead of to. Nature is part of that equation, and it doesn't have to just be learning about or those kinds of things, but with nature.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
See people clapping.
Yeah,
I know, Rachel.
Weird to react on Zoom. I know, it's funny. There were a couple. Were there questions? Should I try to look at?
I didn't think like really necessarily specific questions. Okay. Someone asked about allergies. How often do allergies come up for parents interested in your schools? That's a big obstacle in public schools. Sometimes I've seen that too.
Yeah.
Preschools sometimes too.
Yeah, I think allergies come up most in terms of like food related things. In fact, there was a mention of like the bird feeders, right? And not using nut butters and some of those kinds of things. So that definitely comes up. I would say it's more that kind of like food related allergies than it is being outside kinds of allergies. But remember, in early childhood programs, they're committing for a year. So they're going to be in probably a little different mindset than someone who's like their kids coming on a field trip and they're just not unsure about all of this and have questions that way. So it may not be as much of an issue for us. Although we definitely have, even in nature-based preschools, you hear from families like, oh, they're going to get sick because it's cold outside, or, they kind of have a sniffle. So could you keep them inside because they're sick? No, if they're that sick, they stay home. If they're, because you don't get sick outside, right? Anyway,
probably good for them to be outside.
Right.
Paul just asked about, are you doing preschool right now with COVID, and is it causing problems to pedagogy with that? And I know that you're more in consultant role, but you might talk to the movement in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lots of programs are operating right now. And many have sort of made more of a shift to all outdoors, or really limiting how much they're inside. So inside just for bathrooms, like here at Chippewa here in town, they're outside all day and then they go in for bathroom breaks. But they're just kind of figuring out some temporary solutions for a shelter space, because, now's when this weekend it's been beautiful, but we've had like sort of cold or rainy days, right? And it's these transition seasons that are most challenging. But yeah, and Teresa was saying that they're outside all day as well. Just the bathroom is the biggest thing. And so temperature checks, and like a lot of them are doing, they'll check in beforehand. They'll do temperature checks at home, check in when they get there. Temperature checks are a challenge outside because the weather, finding good thermometers is a bit of an ordeal. But yeah, most across the country, the nature preschools seem to still be operating. There's some interesting differences in terms of whether or not they're having kids wear masks.
Some people get really upset about either side of it too.
Oh my word. Seriously, how is a mask political? But anyway, yes. Like, yeah, so that's been kind of interesting. Yeah, some are not having them here. They're not, the kids under kindergarten are not wearing masks. So yeah.
I have a question regarding risk assessment, more specifically on the part of the child assessing their own risk, a 3 or 4 year old. And I'll use this example of when I was probably about that age. I'd been watching TV. There was a breakfast cereal back then called Jets, and their commercial showed a cartoon little boy who put a cape on, and then he went off and flew. And so I thought, well, that looks like fun. So I got, a bathrobe or sheet or something, and wrapped it on, and I ran off of our porch to fly. Of course, I didn't fly very far. But in my mind, I was not engaging in a risky activity at all, because I was absolutely certain there was no doubt in my mind that when I left that porch, I was going to be airborne.
Right.
Longer than a couple seconds.
Yeah.
So when a child is engaging in some of the risky activities, what an adult would consider risky, how do you introduce the idea of risk without scaring the child or getting them to overthink it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think in that particular example, we have to remember sometimes as adults to check ourselves, right? We overreact often. So I could see an adult in that case, like, whoa, what are you doing? And if it was a tall porch, that's different, but
it was
clearly, yeah. Like sometimes we just have to tell ourselves like, okay, I'm just overreacting. But then what I usually do is I will stop them. I was like, whoa. And then I will express my concern about, I'm concerned this might not be safe. And then, so I might also ask about what's your plan? Like if I don't really know, but I kind of think they're going a direction I don't want to go, I don't want them to go down. I'll say, what's your plan with that? Like when you got the towel out, I'd be like, so Sam, what's your plan with that towel? And then start having a conversation at 4-year-old, right? And so some of it is sort of in the moment, but usually it's, I'm concerned that's not safe. And I often, basically our rule is to keep ourselves, each other, and nature safe. And everything can come back to that. So if I ever sort of want to change behavior for some reason, it's always because it's either you're going to hurt yourself, you're going to hurt your friend, or you're going to, hurt nature in some way, like whacking a tree down or something like that. But yeah, do you feel safe? Right. If you can tell from them that they're uncomfortable, that question of do you feel safe is a great way to sort of redirect it back to them. Yeah. So you can sort of check yourself, pause to like, ooh, and that what's your plan is sort of a pause as well for an adult to go, okay, maybe I can be okay with this and not jump to conclusions. As I said earlier, we sort of try to have this idea of saying yes more often than no, because usually when we say no, it's just about our own adult concerns and it isn't really anything to worry about. Hopefully that helps, Sam.
Sam, I did share a link to a handout from Backwoods Mama about what to say instead of be careful. And it goes back to some phrases you can use about problem solving with risky play. And when we're in a supervisory position, we're going to be watching and hopefully encouraging something else, intervening if we need to. But we can just regularly change the wording and vocabulary that we use with children to help them go back and assess risk on their own, I think. And Paul, you had asked about preschools getting outside now. Tomorrow we'll have a presentation from Carmel Co-op Preschool and what they've been doing. And they've really ended up being outside a whole lot more because of COVID. They already did a lot, had an outdoor classroom and turkey and different things like that at different times of the year. But they are going to be sharing some of their experiences of what they've been learning through this as well with the nature-based early childhood track. So. And Rachel shared a lot of ideas. There have been a lot of discussions around, how people are dealing with COVID in many of the sessions. So hopefully that can be helpful too.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to talk about anything right now without talking about COVID. It's just, yeah. Even when I talk with my friends, finally, I'm like, oh, we'll talk about something else. And then it always somehow comes back to it. But.
It's going to be part of history. We are living history right now. So.
Oh, yes, we are. So many ways. Yep. Cool.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate Rachel. You've got so much wisdom and expertise to share with us. And like I said, her books are great. And she has great information on her social media and through her emails. And she's starting a new support group kind of thing for nature-based preschools this next week, it sounds like, as well. So she's got a lot of things going out there and so much wisdom, practical ideas to make it work. The political savvy.
It was great to see you all. It's so fun to see names and faces I haven't seen forever and all those, NAI and environmental ed folks. So it's good to see you all again. So.
And I think that's where I met you first, was in kind of more that kind of stuff instead of the early nature-based early childhood venue. But so
yeah,
cool.
For sure. Yeah, Paul, I definitely need to come visit soon. It's been way too long. like more than a decade, I think. Not that we're that old. All right. Thank you all. So great. Have a great night.
Thank you. And we do have the social hour, virtual social hour with trivia in about 20 minutes. So hope to see you there. Thanks so much. Thank you, Rachel.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.